Okay, welcome back to another episode of Rotten Reviews. And on this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at John Carpenter's Escape from LA from 1996. Right off the bat, I'm going to say that this film is rotten, and in my opinion, it does deserve to be rotten. It has a 52% rating on the tomato meter, a 39% on the audience score. I actually feel that those numbers are about right. This is the way it feels to me. This is the way it feels to me as a John Carpenter fan and as someone who was a big fan of the original Escape from New York. I think this was an honest attempt by John Carpenter to recapture the feel of Escape from New York and to largely recycle themes, characters, even set piece designs from Escape from New York and make another, I don't know, another cult favorite. I think he largely failed. He came across just too much of a try-hard, so to speak, in trying to create another cult favorite. The thing about having a cult favorite is that these aren't necessarily deliberate attempts to create them. Every cult favorite that I've heard of is a cult favorite because it is later perceived in that way by fans, oftentimes fans that come along much later than when the movie was produced. So in the case of John Carpenter trying to recapture that cult classic feeling of Escape from New York, it's a complete fail. I appreciate that he tried. And certainly in other movies, he's produced a lot of garbage movies. I don't think any of the nitpicks with this film, such as the CGI, or the zany, over-the-top things like Kurt Russell surfing, for example, I don't think those are mistakes. I think those are just John Carpenter trying to create what he thought made this film or made his Escape from New York a classic, a cult classic. Well, he just couldn't pull it off. He just tried too hard. And if we get into the rotten reviews, we'll start with one from August of 2019, 1 star. The special effects are at Sharknado's level. Well, yes, I agree. Some of that was deliberate. Some of that was John Carpenter trying to use the same type of effect technology that he used in Escape from New York to not only capture the feel of Escape from New York, but also to, create the same zany atmosphere, to try to camp it up on himself, so to speak. So the choices that he used as far as blue screen, making the blue screen scenes look like they were blue screen scenes, that was quite deliberate. So that's not a nitpick of the CGI or a nitpick of the effects. Now, I consider a legitimate critique of his effects in this movie to be, when you watch this on Blu-ray and the Blu-ray resolution shows you the flaws in the actual CGI, the computer animated effects, which were not available to John Carpenter during the making of his original Escape from New York. He used CGI. It comes across kind of like the Phantom Menace CGI comes across nowadays on Blu-ray. It comes across as really cheesy and off-putting, and I'm pretty sure that wasn't the director's intent. But then again, when this movie was made, the thought that it would be produced on something like a medium that would put out the resolution of a Blu-ray disc was not in consideration. That technology was far down the road. DVDs hadn't even been released to the public yet. So yes, you can say it's Sharknado level CGI, but that's not where the movie really falls down. If I have to give this a star rating, I'm going to just go out there and say this is 2.5 stars. Not above 2.5, perhaps dropping to 2 at parts, because I respect this as a legitimate remake, so to speak, of Escape from New York. I just don't think it hit the mark, but I appreciate the effort. I think that when you criticize the CGI, you're really criticizing certain things like the submarine, the way the submarine the submarine that Kurt Russell drove into the water towards the end of the movie, that really looks bad on Blu-ray in particular, but a lot of the other stuff is still practical effects. For example, Kurt Russell, hanging from like a bat-looking hang glider and firing his machine gun at bad guys. That's completely practical effects, and it's like something that could have been done in Escape from New York with a bigger budget. But it comes across as really over the top, campy, and cheesy. It doesn't quite give you the same seriousness that the Escape from New York film did. I mean, yeah, Escape from New York is campy and cheesy, but for its day, it actually played it straight. And if you did laugh, that wasn't the intent. In fact, as a fan of the original movie, I was a teenager when it came out. Um, I wasn't laughing at it at all. I actually thought it looked cool. I thought the over-the-top, almost comic-y camp of it and the characters, they were awesome, and I took it completely seriously. Nowadays, I don't think the younger generation would. I think they would just see this as over-the-top Sharknado type stuff. So it's just a generational thing. Let's continue. 4 stars. This one gets hated a ton for being silly and over the top, but honestly, that was its purpose, and on the whole, it worked very well. Russell's as badass as he was the first time, and the cast on the whole works. The final act's balls to the wall fun through even the end credits. It was too far ahead of its time in 1996. If 96 had our modern day action and parody mind frame, this would have done a lot better. I'd easily rate this one as Carpenter's best post-prime films. Take the bad CGI away, it's not a bad filmed movie at all. I largely agree. Certainly not 4 stars, though. That if you're giving it 4 stars, you've got posters. You've got every John Carpenter poster on your bedroom wall. You're just a fanboy. Because honestly, this peaks at 2.5 stars, even if you allow for the camp and whatnot. Now, this review brings up something interesting in that Kurt Russell does play exactly his authentic Snake Plissken character from the first Escape from New York. He does a great job at it. He had fun doing it, you can tell. He is 100% authentic to his character from the first movie, and Carpenter actually shot the same types of scenes. For example, when Snake Plissken is shown the weapons that will be at his disposal, it's like the same scene straight out of Escape from New York. Again, a lot of it is almost, it's completely recycled. Not exactly shot for shot recycled, but an example would be in the first Escape from New York, the bad guy, he's called Mr. Big. He is riding around in New York City in a gigantic Cadillac with crystal chandeliers as ornaments on the sides of it. For its day, that was pretty over the top and interesting. It was unique. We hadn't seen that in a movie, maybe in a comic book, but not in a movie. And Carpenter did that in this one, almost having, he had the bad guy in a very similar vehicle, a little more futuristic, but again, like a disco ball type thing on the outside. So he kind of remade the bad guy's vehicle, for example. A lot of the stuff was recycled. A lot of the characters were recycled. I mean, they were different characters with different names, but they were just like clones with slight variations of the original, like Ernst Borgnine's cab driver, for example, Adrienne Barbeau's character. These characters were recycled and repackaged a little bit in the next one. But again, we had seen this before, so it wasn't as unique. That's another reason I don't think this will become a cult classic, even years down the road, because we'd seen this before. So the people of my age that consider Escape from New York a cult classic will be dead and buried by the time we actually forget about the first one and think this is something interesting. The younger generation isn't going to latch on to this. It's very dated. So let's move on. 4 stars. The original Escape from New York is a cult classic of the first order and is a touchstone film for Gen Xer nerds everywhere. I'll agree with that. That's what I said. John Carpenter and Kurt Russell reunited 15 years after the original to make this long-awaited sequel. It's nowhere as good as the original film, and it's more of a big-budget remake of the original film than a sequel, similar to Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2: Dead by Dawn, which was essentially a bigger-budget remake of the first film. And this sequel, in the future year, 1998, okay, again, another weird thing about it is the original Escape from New York movie took place, I believe, in 1996 or 97 in the universe of the film. Now, this movie was actually made in 1996, so it's using the same universe from the original film and calling it 1998, which is kind of funny because it's almost turning itself into an alternate reality 1998, but that wasn't the intention. That was, it's not an alternate history or alternate reality type film. This is simply just John Carpenter staying within the same universe he had created back in the 80s. And, you know, it just didn't hit right. It just didn't push the buttons on the younger generation like the first movie did for people of my age. So let's move on. 3.5 stars. Oh my God, as a parody, it is quite enjoyable. As a high concept action film, it falls short on many levels. Right. You have to kind of take it as a parody of its original Escape from New York, a parody that's set within its own universe. That's about it. 1 star. Why, Snake? Why couldn't you just stay in Cleveland? I mean, you got out of New York, which was amazing, but you never should have gone to LA. This movie is bad. It had potential. The story is decent, but the execution is not good. Personally, they tried to incorporate far too much CGI into this film, and it was done so poorly that the end result is abysmal. There are too many scenes to count with bad CGI, but my personal favorite, example the worst, is the surfing sequence. Yeah, again, that's not all just bad CGI. That's Carpenter trying to create the effect of what he was doing in the original film, and he chose to use outdated CGI deliberately in a lot of places to capture the feel of the first one, and obviously coming at this from the perspective of a younger person in 2019, this is just going to look like he didn't know what he was doing, but that's not actually the case here. 0.5 star. The worst film I've seen since Shark Exorcist. I haven't seen Shark Exorcist, but it sounds funnier than this, so I don't know. 2.5 stars. Snake is a true badass. Sure, they kind of recycled the first one, but that doesn't make it bad, just not as exciting. And, you know, speaking of recycling, Snake Plissken as a character was iconic to someone my age. Um, and actually, I learned something new. Snake Plissken was actually recycled to create the character of Solid Snake in the video game franchise of Metal Gear. So, you know, there's that. So the younger generation might think that this is somehow a rip-off of, you know, a video game, but it's actually the opposite. The video game Metal Gear ripped off Snake from Escape from New York. It doesn't have the edgy feel today that it did. I mean, in the early 80s, calling your character Snake Plissken right off the bat, that was something different and edgy. In today's world, even in the 90s, it wouldn't have been edgy or different. So again, it's another aspect of the movie that just is going to fail in recapturing the feel of the first. It just doesn't hit the same resonance with the audience. 1 star. It feels like John Carpenter really wanted to have some fun and direct a B-quality movie. There is much ridiculous stuff in this movie that is better if I number them out. Number 1, there is an excess of exposition. Number 2, the acting from most of the characters is awful. Number 3, all of the CGI is terrible and fake as shit, like Mortal Kombat level of terrible. Sharknado has better effects. Number 4, motorcycles explode for no reason. Number 5, both the villains are ridiculous. First, there is the Barbie named Utopia. Yeah, again, a lot of that is what the reviewer said in the first sentence. John Carpenter wanted to make a really crazy, hard-hitting B movie like he did with Escape from New York. The thing is, when you say B movie, a lot of people my age took Escape from New York far too credibly to consider it a B movie, even though, looking back, it was a B movie. a B movie that just hit a cultural mark, so to speak. Half a star, so lousy on so many levels. If you saw Escape from New York, don't waste your time watching Escape from LA. It is essentially the exact same movie. It is also a continuing theme out of the cesspool called Hollywood, hostility and animosity towards all things Christian. Both presidents are portrayed as weak. Both LA after an earthquake and New York are islands surrounded by a wall and the same police with the same orders to shoot. Well, exactly. It's recycled from the first movie. It's kind of a cheap, weird way of creating the New York City isolated prison, walled-in environment and transporting that to LA by saying that an earthquake laid waste to LA, and that's how they were able to turn it into a prison. Again, it's completely recycled from the first movie. It's nothing we hadn't seen before. That's another reason this missed the mark. The Christian theme in this movie, the president is actually kind of like a sinister character that's a Christian conservative who somehow has taken over the country since the first movie. It doesn't fit with the first movie because in the first movie, the president, played by Donald Pleasance, was simply just a weak man and a politician, and there wasn't any backstory to him. There was no political slant to him. It wasn't even known if he was a Republican, Democrat, or what he was, or any of the other politics around it. He was just a president, and he was kind of inept and weak. And he had like a zany performance at the end. And that's another reason that this movie fails, because Cliff Robertson is this, over the top religious conservative dictator type president. And this plot line is that instead of Kurt Russell going into the prison city to save the president, he's actually going into LA, the prison city, to capture the president's runaway daughter who has stolen some kind of high-tech EMP pulse satellite technology. It's kind of weird. It's doing a lot of things at one time, but yet still trying to tie into the president rescue angle from the first movie. It's really weird like that. It doesn't quite work. It's an example of John Carpenter recycling stuff from the first movie, but in this case, it hurts the movie outright. He needed something more unique. The recycling got a little overdone. It was like recycling of recycling, so to speak. 2.5 stars. The kitsch and grimy charm of 1981's Escape from New York is replaced by 1990's action movie blandness in this sequel, along with surely some of the worst special effects ever seen in a mainstream Hollywood movie. Now, I think the big thing in this review is the bland comment. When I saw this, I didn't see it at the theater, but I saw it when it came out on home video, at the time VHS. I don't remember a lot about it. Like the middle stretch of the movie, I don't remember much of, because it was bland. It was forgettable. Again, the reviewer's correct in that it put a lot of 90s action type vibe into it, but that's not what the original had. The original was darker. It was stranger. It almost had a horror type feeling to it. It didn't have like just nonstop action. So it didn't fit with what I was expecting from Escape from New York. This turned it from dark into like just nonstop action. And even in the 90s, just nonstop action, we had so many of these type movies that my mind is just a blank on everything that happened in the middle. In fact, my mind is also a blank on the individual characters. I know John Buscemi was one of them, kind of the cab driver role, I think. Other than that, it's completely forgettable, because at the time I watched it, it just kind of went by. It went in one side of my head and went out the other. Just bland. And even in the 90s, it was nothing special. 2 stars. Fun to watch if you don't take it too seriously. It's more of a fun comic book style adventure than a serious action film. Requires a lot of suspension of disbelief to be fully enjoyed, but it's a fun movie nonetheless. I don't know. Again, I say it's a little bit too boring and bland to be fun. I think fun was just like going into it initially anticipating seeing more in the Escape from New York universe, and then as a fan just kind of being bored by it mostly. Let's move on. 3.5 stars. Escape from LA is a strange one. It is campy enough to be considered a B movie and filled with enough A-listers behind and in front of the camera to not be considered one. As with Escape from New York, this one features Snake Plissken, once again adeptly played by Kurt Russell, who has no problem getting into the same boots even after a gap of 15 years, being asked by the American government in assisting them to find something, in this case a doomsday device. Actually, the president's daughter and a doomsday device. But now, this review brings up something interesting too. I will give John Carpenter credit, or maybe Kurt Russell, he needs the credit. Not only did he play Snake Plissken perfectly, but he still looked like Snake Plissken. He looked like just a barely older Snake Plissken. His physique was still there. It was not off-putting at all. You wouldn't have guessed that 15 years had gone by. There were other flaws with the movie, but the fact that it had been a 15-year gap in the story of this character, and in the movie it's only a gap of a year or so, that wasn't off-putting at all. It was completely believable. And I guess I should give the credit to Kurt Russell for just keeping himself in shape between the two movies, because there was no de-aging technology, and it didn't need CGI to make him back into his Snake Plissken character. He still looked like Snake Plissken, so I'll have to give him the credit for that. 2 stars. Escape from LA is easily the craziest and most confused movie I've ever seen. I have no idea how to describe it. For all I know, it's amazing. It could be terrible. After only having seen it once, I just can't say for sure how good it is. It's extremely weird and unpredictable, and sometimes it works, and most of the time it doesn't. It feels like a strange and quite frankly kind of stupid choice for Carpenter. The original Escape movie was decent at best, and it certainly didn't need this wacko sequel. Again, this is a review from 2018, and I think this is coming from somebody that saw both movies, but saw them both many years after they were released. For all I know, this reviewer, saw this movie in 2005, the first Escape from New York, and then saw this one in 2018. That's why you get these reviews. They're definitely not someone of my age that would appreciate this for what it was. But that's why I do these rotten reviews, because I want to see how films aged. I want to see what people think of them today, or at least really close to today, and see, what people think of them versus what I thought of them when they came out. That's why I try to do these rotten reviews on films that are, close to 10 years, if not older, because I can see how they've aged. That's more fascinating to me. A lot of these films, I judged them more than 20 years ago. My judgment isn't going to change. People my age, Gen Xers if you want, they are not going to change their opinions on these films. But it's just interesting to see how the next generation views them, and what their take of it is, seeing it, in a lot of cases, the millennial generation is watching these movies at the same time points that in their age as we were watching in ours, and yet just to see the cultural difference in how they view these films is fascinating to me. So let's continue. 2.5 stars. Not as great as Escape from New York, but Kurt Russell has made this role his own. John Carpenter isn't as polished as he was in the early 80s, but this is still a good sequel. I don't think it's actually considered a good sequel, even by me. I think it's like a good attempt at a sequel, but by itself, it's not a good sequel. It's got too much recycling, in my opinion. John Carpenter could have given us the same feel and then just shown us something new in the same universe, but he didn't. He just attempted to flat out recycle it and recapture that feeling, but the atmosphere alone, it doesn't recapture the feeling. 4 stars. I enjoyed it as a spoof that is not too spoofy, somewhat like Con Air. I disagree on that. Con Air is far better. Con Air is not trying to spoof a previous movie, at least not directly like this one is. Con Air, well, this is a subject I wouldn't go into on rotten reviews because I don't consider Con Air to be rotten, but I'll look into it and see if it's worth it. But anyway, continuing, sometimes dumb in a fun way, sometimes dumb in an annoying way, but I had a couple of laughs. Kurt Russell is a great macho moron. Yeah, he was, the thing about Snake Plissken was that in the end of Escape from New York, the thing that made it so cool was that after this hero saving the president, he still had the attitude of basically screw the system and every part of it. He went into the movie like that, not being put to the task of rescuing the president because he was a great hero, but because the government forced him to do it. Otherwise, a little bomb in his throat would, kill him. And at the end of the movie, it hadn't changed his opinion at all about modern society or the government. He was still, wanted to give the big middle finger to modern society. And so at the end of the film, not only is the plot about saving the president, but the president in particular had a tape that he needed, a speech that he needed to deliver to some important world congress, like at the UN, I think it was. Things were hanging in the balance, like perhaps another world war. And so at the end of it, Snake Plissken went ahead and saved the president, but as his big middle finger to society at the end, he swapped the tape that the president was going to deliver to the UN with a tape that was taken from the cab driver in Escape from New York, Ernst Borgnine's character, which was big band music. And he swapped it out for that. And then as you see the president playing the big band music to the UN, Snake Plissken pulls out the original cassette and just starts ripping the tape out of the cassette to destroy it as he walks away. His big FU to society. That was classic. That was awesome. Snake Plissken didn't really have a character arc. He was just like still the same coming out of it, and it was a big middle finger at the end, and it was just fantastic. Now in this movie, John Carpenter tries to do the same thing by having Snake Plissken activate the actual EMP doomsday device and have all the satellites orbiting Earth shut off the power, shut out the electricity to the world. Um, it didn't have the same effect because we had seen this before, and it didn't have the same, cult film type impact. It was just more of the same, very recycled, and it came across as flat. It didn't feel like it felt in the first movie. So I'm just putting that out there. 3 stars on this review. 15 years after Snake's time in New York, he returns to Los Angeles for one more round. But remember, it's not 15 years in the movie. It's 15 years for us. I believe it's only a year or so in the movie. But continuing. But this time the results are kind of odd. Kurt Russell is of course awesome, and the rest of the cast is fine too. The film's effects have aged poorly. In 1996 they were considerable top of the line, but now it's just silly looking. No, in 1996 these effects were not top of the line. John Carpenter chose these effects because he thought they would bring back the feel of the first movie. So no, let me correct a younger viewer. These were not considered top-of-the-line effects. In fact, people criticized them at the time that didn't know what he was trying to do. So even in the 90s, this was considered bad effects as far as just judging the effects without the intent. Let's continue. The soundtrack is also pretty cool, featuring a lot of alternative rock and metal music from the mid-90s. Escape from LA is sort of aware that it's a rehash of the first film. No, it's not sort of aware. It's 100% aware. It's a deliberate recycling of the first film. So again, I think this is a younger viewer that can be corrected in that, no, John Carpenter knew what he was doing. He just didn't execute it well enough to create another cult classic. 5 stars. Great example how the sequel can be better than the original. John Carpenter does a great job putting the viewer into this world, and it's one hell of a fun movie. Kurt is beyond badass as usual. No, the sequel wasn't better, even as a fan of the original. No. You're way off here. I think this is a John Carpenter fanboy, surely, because that's over the top. 4.5 stars. I give this an 89 B+. Okay. 2 stars. This update or sequel is not for everyone. Lots of cringeworthy antics and a film that sits uneasily with the gritty original. This film looks like they ran out of money while making it and decided to amp up the camp and cheese. Unsatisfactory given what they had. No, I disagree. John Carpenter had the budget he needed. This just came across wrong. People, fans my age of the original movie knew exactly what he was trying to do. It just bored us, 1 star. To be honest, I watched this years ago and was incredibly disappointed after loving the original since I was a kid. I will not replay that disappointed feeling, so I will just give it a 1 star and call it a day. Nah, I think 1 star is too harsh. I don't fault the reviewer for that, but I'll give this like 2 stars, a solid 2 stars, even 2.5. It depends what my mood is on this. Maybe I change my mind with another viewing. But no, 2 stars, that's fair, I think. 3 stars, not as good as Escape from New York, but there was enough action and fun to make it worth watching. Slightly recommend. I think 3 stars is too high. Maybe if you're just a big John Carpenter fan and you're an original fan of the, Escape from New York. 1/2 star, one big fat sad cliche after another, truly terrible. Yeah, that was the point. Even the first one was a little bit cliched, but it was weird enough that we overlooked it. This one was a deliberate recycle. Of course, it was cliched. Between the 15 years between these films, we had seen all this stuff done again so many different ways, of course, cliched. 2.5 stars. Less of a sequel than a beat-for-beat remake. Escape from LA never manages to capture the same cynical overview of its predecessor, and while it's just as zany, it borders more on being annoying than being campy. I'll agree with that. Again, Kurt Russell tried to be cynical like that. He did a good job, but it just didn't hit like it did before. We had seen it before. It follows the same general story structure of Escape from New York. Criminal forced into highly guarded prison to accomplish goal, lest he fall victim to a death-inducing device within 10 hours, and yet never feels as simplistic as the 1981 film. Yeah, it's like over convoluted. It's got too much stuff crammed in there, which was the wrong choice. The first one was very simple. This one kind of took and recycled that simple part, but then added a whole bunch of extra complicated things to it. So yeah, I agree that it had too much going on. 4 stars. It's better than his previous Escape. No, 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 it's not in any way. 4.5 stars. Over the top and amazing in so many ways that the 90s came to be known for. Somehow I wish Kurt Russell and John Carpenter would come together to make a new one, maybe pass the torch on to a child. No, it's not that kind of a movie. This can't even work as a franchise. I've heard it said that there was a plan, if this movie had been successful, to make a Escape from Mars, and this Escape from Mars was repackaged into the Ghosts of Mars. That may or may not be true, but no, no, no. This can't work as a franchise. The original movie was only a cult classic. It wasn't a blockbuster of its day. It was just a cult classic. So you can't really make franchises out of cult classics. You try, but you just get B and C, D, and E movies out of it. They get worse as it goes. No, I disagree. 2.5 stars. It's pretty bad, but it's enjoyably bad. Assuming you enjoy bad movies starring Kurt Russell specifically, okay, kind of agree. 4 stars. Surrender to the camp and enjoy the cheesy attitude. This is as bad as some say it is, with hilarious dialogues and everyone being a terrible shot. At the same time, 20 times better than what you'd suspect. Rich in action, carnival-esque visuals, and seedy atmosphere. Some critics who just hate movies should stop torturing themselves and watch this guy instead, because that's a fun movie and no level of jaded can take that away. I kind of get where you're going with this, but I think you're overplaying how good this movie is. I disagree. Bump it down to 2 stars, 2.5. 2.5 stars. It's borderline so bad it's good. Kurt Russell plays the same over-the-top 80s badass among some horrid special effects and adds some extreme basketball surfing, hang gliding action to keep it interesting to those 90s kids. Yeah, that was kind of weird. Snake Plissken was just like a gun-wielding, cynical hero. Or the hero that didn't want to be a hero, an anti-hero. In the first movie. In the second movie, they tried to give him some sports activities, hang gliding, basketball, dunks. It just didn't work for me. It was something new, sure, but it just didn't work for me as a fan of the original. Half a star. Escape from LA took too many liberties with physics, psychology, and action movie tropes to be taken seriously. Escape from New York was hugely popular for its low-key dystopian world. Everything felt lived in and relatively simple. Escape from LA had over-the-top plastic surgeons, serial killers, tsunami surfing, and transgender paragliding assaults on a clone farm. The movie simply does not take itself seriously enough to enjoy a cool factor beyond I have seen the worst movie in the world. I largely agree with that. It's got too much crazy stuff put into it. It was as though John Carpenter asked a team of people to come up with the craziest stuff that he could cram into it, because a lot of this you can just tell John Carpenter didn't think it up himself. His original was, yeah, low-key, and it was very simplistic. Um, Let's continue on. 2.5 stars. It's preposterous, and there's nothing particularly new that wasn't introduced in the last one. Escape from LA is nonetheless an extremely fun and entertaining watch with plenty of social commentary strewn throughout. I don't know about the social commentary because I don't remember that. I watched it and like a lot of it's forgettable to me, so if it did have social commentary, it certainly didn't work. 2.5 stars. Cool premise, cheesy execution. 2.5 stars. Not as good as the first, but it's still entertaining enough to enjoy, but gets a bit silly and predictable, but worth a watch. 2 stars. Sure, the soundtrack features Zombie and Tool, and Russell is a king, but this movie looks extremely dated and is mostly ridiculous. A lame sequel, if ever there was one. Yeah, it's supposed to be a lame sequel. 1 star. What a piece of crap. 3 stars. It probably would have helped if the satire was more precisely aimed or even more dumbed down. It's an overly masculine genre movie that doesn't particularly add to the genre, but still Kurt Russell is a god, and there's something really enjoyable about the datedness of the whole thing. I kind of agree, but 3 stars is too much. 3.5 stars. A lot sillier than Escape from New York, but that's because Carpenter crafted a more overtly political and satirical version of the same story this time around. Yeah, I'll agree, the Christian president angle, it was a little bit, edging into the political statements. But then again, this was the time period where you had like Al Gore's wife, Tipper Gore, like wanting to censor music, rap music in particular, and she started the whole, the MPAA ratings, or the RIAA ratings, whatever you want to call it, for music CDs. This was that time period where there were conservative groups trying to they were trying to have a backlash about not only rap music, but also about, during this time period, the home delivery of pornography really exploded. The internet was starting to explode with it, and certainly home video, had done wonders for the pornography business. And so there was a conservative backlash about this at the time. This is all a very 90s thing, and Carpenter, obviously tried to put a little bit of that into it, but it failed because I hardly noticed it. And also, the choice of Cliff Robertson's character for the president, it didn't fit with the earlier film. The movie made no attempt to explain in this universe how it had gone from, your standard weak political president to all of a sudden some weird conservative dictator. That was a little off-putting. So anyway, moving on. 2 stars. In 2000, an earthquake strikes Los Angeles, the San Fernando Valley floods, and California turns into an island from Malibu to Anaheim. An American presidential candidate, Cliff Robertson, who is also an outspoken theocrat, has been saying that LA is sinful and has been punished by God. When he is elected president, he declares that anyone not conforming to the new moral America laws he creates, which ban such things as tobacco, alcoholic beverages, red meat, firearms. Yeah, again, it's kind of saying what I was saying. In the 90s, you had this conservative movement thing going on. We don't see it today like that. So it's a very 90s thing to have in the film. 3 stars. It's good in a cheesy way. Yeah. I'm not going to say it's good, though. Overall, it's not. As a fan of the original, it just falls flat, largely boring. I'm going to say I agree again with the tomato meter and the audience score. I'm frankly surprised that the tomato meter is this high at 52%. I would have expected to see this at 20% on the tomato meter, but again, I still can't figure out the critics. So I will try to figure out these critics at a future time, perhaps on my next episode, because I am going to bid you farewell until my next episode of Rotten Reviews.